Native American and Early American History. He is a prolific author. Did I say that? He's written 5 books covering different aspects of Native American history. Uncas, First of the Mohicans, published in 2003. The Head in Edward Nugent's Hand, Roanoke's Forgotten Indians, published in 2007. And Native America, A History, a nice textbook published in 2010. And the image that was on the flyer actually comes from the cover. I want to meet that guy. Is he still around? He's gorgeous. I really like the cover. Since 1999, he has worked as a consultant for the United States Department of Justice and several of New York's Indian nations on historical issues related to their claims of sovereignty and their rights to their lands. Geneseo is very fortunate to have a scholar the level of expertise in this field and in this topic area, and we are so pleased that he came to give us this presentation today. So, Michael, thank you so much.
Now I'm all embarrassed to start. But let me just begin with a couple of premises, and if you don't accept these, then we may have a problem and not much point going on. Just a couple of points I think that are worth making. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is that if a number of people had had their way, neither the Senecas nor any of the Six Nations would still be around in New York State. Let alone still be here governing themselves under a written constitution that is older than that of half of the American states and older than many of the countries in Europe, right? So I think there's some irony. It's worth noting that the Seneca Nation is the largest employer now in Niagara County, which is what I used to explain to my daughter in her English class what irony is. So I think that's a first premise to keep in mind. Second, the Federal Trade and Intercourse Act, 1790. If you look at the Constitution is an incredibly sparse document, and the first federal Congress wrote legislation to flesh out the Constitution, to give those sparse phrases some life, right? The Judiciary Act of 1789 set up the structure of the federal bench. The Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790, the first one was passed in 1790, was revised every couple of years thereafter up until 1834. That was the fundamental law of the United States regarding Indian affairs. And the Trade and Intercourse Acts did a number of things. The fundamental goal of this legislation was to maintain a peaceful and orderly frontier. President Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, really designed the Indian policy of the newly independent United States. Simply recognized that peace was cheaper than war. The United States could not afford to pay its veteran soldiers, let alone to pay for Indian war. They wanted peace. The Trade and Intercourse Act included a lot of provisions to do that. Again, it was revised periodically thereafter. But every iteration of the Trade and Intercourse Act had a provision specifying how Indian land was to be acquired. How things like the Treaty of Big Tree hanging on the wall. It spelled out the specific process. And what the Trade and Intercourse Act said was that any purchase of Indian land, anywhere, didn't specify where, any purchase of Indian land, if it was not undertaken by commissioners appointed by the federal government, and then not subsequently ratified by the United States, was, to quote the law, null and void and of no effect. And I mention that point to make clear something, that the loss of lands, to some extent by the Senecas, but to a greater extent by their eastern neighbors, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, the Cayugas, the Mohawks. That this loss of land, it wasn't manifest destiny, it wasn't a natural progression, it wasn't the order of the thing. Much of this dispossession was quite simply criminal and a violation of the laws of the United States. Simple as that. Many of these transactions were done through real estate deeds negotiated by the state of New York. The state of New York was informed by the federal government, weak and ineffective federal government, that their actions were illegal, and the state went ahead and did it anyways. Okay? That's the second premise. Third premise, the Treaty of Canandaigua, November 11th, 1794. Treaty of Canandaigua. Treaty of Canandaigua was negotiated at the tail end of a period where Indian nations, Indian confederacies in the West, in the Ohio country, had dealt a number of devastating blows to American military forces. Right? The worst defeat U.S. forces ever suffered at the hands of Indians was not Custer's last stand, it was the Battle of Maumee River in November of 1791. There was tremendous fear on the part of the United States, and certainly in Western New Yorkers too. You see them in the Frontier Lands papers at the State Archives. There was tremendous fear that if the Senecas, the most populous and still the most powerful of the Iroquois, joined with these Western nations, that the American frontier would be indefensible. Remember, you still had British posts at Niagara, you still had the British at Oswego, you still had the British at Detroit, you had a supply of weapons that could go to these Indian tribes if the British felt to do that. There was a great threat. So Timothy Pickering was sent by President Washington to negotiate a treaty with the Six Nations. And the Treaty of Canandaigua was primarily a Seneca treaty. And the Treaty of Canandaigua in 1794 stated explicitly, right, that the Six Nations had the right to the free use and enjoyment. That's the operative phrase. The free use and enjoyment of all their remaining lands for as long as they chose to hang on to those lands. Free use and enjoyment of their lands. Under our Constitution, federal laws and treaties are the supreme law of the land. That's what the Constitution says. And what we'll see is that despite federal laws and despite federal treaties, there were systematic and consistent efforts to go after their lands. Some of these transactions were legal in the sense that they followed the law, but as one lawyer told me when I first started working on litigation involving Indian tribes, he read to me a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court Justice, and Oliver Wendell Holmes was listening to a lawyer. This is a case that had nothing to do with Indians, but Oliver Wendell Holmes was listening to a lawyer fulminating on about justice this and justice that, and we need to procure justice, and Holmes had had enough of this, right? You know how the Supreme Court sometimes interferes and interrupts lawyers before them. And Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "Young man, this is a court of law, it's not a court of justice." And I think that's a fundamental thing to keep in mind when we talk about Indian affairs and Indian law. Okay, so despite the Treaty of Canandaigua, despite the Federal Trade and Intercourse Act, Indian landholding in New York was always insecure. Throughout the 1790s, and then really, well, the last one was 1846, the state of New York purchased land from the Oneidas, from the Onondagas, from the Mohawks up at St. Regis, from the Cayugas. And the Senecas as well faced these kinds of threats as well. But the Senecas were a very different kettle of fish in the sense that they were much more powerful. They were very close to the British in Canada and were not to be pushed around in the same sort of way. But the Senecas faced attempts. They faced the attempts of course, Robert Morris in 1797 that led to the Big Tree Treaty. And then his successors, right, the Ogden Land Company, or as a very good historian field, Lawrence Houghton calls the nefarious Ogden Land Company, word that I don't think was used anymore. Anyways, at Big Tree, as many of you know, the Senecas parted with all of their lands, essentially all of their lands west of the Genesee River, saving about, with the exception of about 200,000 acres that was scattered across 11 or so reservations. And the treaty is often described in the accounts as a complete debacle, as a drunken mess, right? Morris's son negotiated the treaty. It was a legal treaty. It was a federal commissioner present, but he talked about this in their correspondence, brought alcohol to facilitate the negotiations, dispensed that alcohol liberally and strategically, and at points in the proceedings, the treaty was delayed because people needed to nurse hangovers and come back to the table. And it's often, Red Jacket is sort of the central figure in this treaty. He posed, he postured, he strutted, he got screaming drunk, and in the end he negotiated this treaty. And it's often described as his failure, but I would suggest that there's more to it, right? White settlers were overrunning Seneca lands, moving through this area. Crimes were committed routinely against Seneca persons and against Seneca property. No jury would protect their rights. And in the face of these overruns, and this is how dispossession worked, right? Red Jacket, and other Seneca leaders, and they accepted bribes, there's no doubt about this, signed a treaty where they gave up the bulk of their land but hung on to 11 strategically and culturally critical areas. I would argue that to some extent it's the best deal they could have gotten. Of course, they parted with all this land in exchange for sort of an investment scheme where $100,000 was invested in Bank of the United States stocks, and the interest in those stocks was paid to the Senecas every year. At some point when the stock prices dropped, Congress intervened during the Jacksonian era and just decided to pay them $6,000 a year, and that's sort of been the payment ever since. And there were other Seneca transactions. In 1802, the United States acquired what it felt was a strategically critical piece of land along the Niagara River. The state of New York purchased Grand Island and other islands in the Niagara River in 1815, September of 1815. No federal treaty commissioner was present. The courts upheld the legality of the Grand Island purchase because the courts concluded that although New York bought the islands, and they bought the islands in violation of the Trade Intercourse Act, it didn't matter because they already owned the islands. We could go into that. There were other attempts. There was a determined effort by the Ogden Land Company in 1819 to relocate the Senecas to anywhere, to concentrate them at the Allegheny Reservation in the far southwestern corner of the state. That was one option. To move them to Arkansas, which some Ogden people said was kind of like New York. It's not, right? Or better yet, Green Bay. With the help of their Quaker missionary allies, the Senecas beat back that attempt in 1819. And they were very effective, the Senecas, in the West, in resisting efforts to sell their land. Not so much in the eastern part of their reserve, right? And Ogden and the Ogden Company was quite effective in acquiring Seneca lands along the Genesee River. Mary Jemison, right, the white woman of the Genesee, sold lands, the Garda lands in 1822, 1823, accepting a small tract which she hung on to as a personal reserve. Several years later, representatives of the company tried for more. This was the 1826 treaty. The agreement was signed in August 31st of that year, and what happened is that Seneca ceded all their reservations along the Genesee River. All the Genesee Valley lands were gone. And then each of the other reservations, Tonawanda Indian Reservation today, Buffalo Creek, Allegheny, and Cattaraugus were reduced by about a third. So pretty significant transaction. That treaty was sent to the Senate for ratification, and the Senate voted 26-26 on the ratification vote. That's we all know. I mean, if we go back to civics lesson, did they talk about ratification, Bradley? Not yet. You're too young for that, right? We'll let you off the hook. But it takes more than a tie vote to ratify a treaty. The federal government seemed kind of lackadaisical about it and said, well, it's a private real estate transaction between the Ogden Land Company and the Seneca Nation, so therefore no proper ratification is needed. That's an object of some debate. Okay, but we'll take it to that. So some significant land loss. And what I'd kind of like to talk to you about today is not so much these treaties and not so much the actual land loss, but what the Senecas themselves were doing while this was going on, sort of shift the attention away from leaders, right, and national politics, away from people like Red Jacket as much as possible, and really try to get at the heart of what's going on amongst rank and file Senecas, what ordinary Seneca people. And what I think you see, if you look at these records, and the records are, there's a massive amount of material available for studying Seneca history, tons and tons of material. The National Archives has thousands and thousands of pages of material related to the Senecas. New York State Archives, thousands of pages of material related to Seneca history during this period. The various Quaker meetings, Philadelphia Friends, thousands and thousands of pages of material. There's no shortage of material for getting at the heart of Seneca history. It's just that historians haven't really looked at it in that kind of detail because they've been focusing on national policy, federal policy, they've been focusing on the misbehavior of the state of New York, or they've been focusing on leaders, whether those leaders are state officials or leaders in Indian communities. And if you look in these records, I think what you see is that there were three forces, right? right? Three qualities, or three elements that help the Senecas resist dispossession and removal, right? Three forces, and I think these three forces help them as well preserve a surprising degree of autonomy and a surprising degree of sovereignty. The first of these is probably the one most people are familiar with, the religious revitalization movement led by a prophetic figure named Handsome Lake, which became something of a social gospel that preached practices and cultural forms that were consistent with efforts to resist the sale of lands and to preserve a Seneca land base. So that's the first, the revitalization movement of Handsome Lake. The second of these is the contribution of Quaker missionaries as teachers and as essentially craft instructors for the Seneca Nation. The Philadelphia yearly meeting of the Society of Friends provided vital assistance which the Senecas exploited to hang on to their lands. And then third, the Senecas creatively made changes to their culture, made changes to their ways of living that aided them, I think, in hanging on to their land and make lives for themselves on a steadily diminishing land base. Okay, so three factors. So let me just kind of march through those for the talk here. And the first of these, of course, Handsome Lake, right? In 1799, Handsome Lake experienced the first of a number of visions. And these visions became the core of something that we call the Gaiweo, the good news, which he began to preach across longhouses throughout Iroquois. Not everyone bought it, not everyone took the message, but certainly it was preached quite widely, it still is. And unlike contemporaries of his, there were prophetic figures throughout the Great Lakes region. There were prophetic figures throughout the Ohio country. There were prophetic figures throughout the South amongst the Creeks and the Cherokees as well during this exact same time period. But unlike them, Handsome Lake did not preach a message of armed resistance. He did not call for violence. Handsome Lake, I think, recognized quite clearly the geographical realities of where the Senecas were that really made armed resistance futile, a losing proposition. What they did, however, was assemble a message, Handsome Lake and his followers, a message that defined sin, that spelled out what an individual needed to do to achieve salvation, defined heaven and hell, and provided guidance for how Senecas should live in company with their white neighbors. No small accomplishment there. Handsome Lake looked past tribal and geographic boundaries. He described his followers as Indians, which is significant in of itself. He talked of red people as being opposed and different to white people, the red-skinned race and the white-skinned race. He talked of different classes of humanity, quote, which were placed separate from each other, having different customs, manners, laws, and religion. And the conclusion you draw from this, right, is that, this is what he said, Indians were entitled to a different religion, a religion adapted to their customs, manners, and way of thinking, their own institutions. Handsome Lake had practical advice. He denounced the sin of drunkenness. He told his followers that, quote, your chiefs have violated and betrayed your trust by selling lands. He argued that all Senecas, all Indian people should enjoy the land equally and no one had the right to sell it. Any land sale, he argued, offended the Great Spirit. Another phrase he used, which is an innovative phrase, Great Spirit, that wasn't used all along. But he recognized, I think this is where his contribution was, he recognized that the Senecas lived in the midst of white people. Senecas had to cut through New York counties to visit each other. They had to move past white settlements. They had to interact with white people on a day-to-day basis. So he realized, I think, that compromises had to be made. He said that the Creator intended for Senecas to live off of animals, but because of the spread of the Americans, the game in the forest would be depleted, and it was perfectly acceptable for Senecas to raise livestock. In fact, some of the most interesting documents in the National Archives are the frequent complaints of Senecas to the federal agent in Canandaigua, Jasper Parish, about the theft of Seneca livestock. In other words, rustlers were preying on Seneca horse herds. What else? So the religion, well, Hanson Lake talked about heaven and hell. And this is where I think most people focus on his religion. He talked about how in one of his visions, he journeyed along a road until this road hit a fork. And one of these forks led to the house of the Great Spirit. The other led to the house of torment, capital H, capital T, which was a hell reserved for Indian sinners. And this was a hell that would have made all the Geneseo students who've taken humanities would know this, would make Dante proud. A drunkard, for example, is forced by a malevolent figure named the Punisher, who incidentally was red, had cloven hoofs, and a tail, to drink molten metal, which he spewed from his mouth in a blaze of fire. There's a husband and wife in this hell, and as they began to argue, their tongues and eyes became so distorted and twisted that neither of them could see nor speak. Card players on fire, wife beaters striking women as their arms exploded, the flesh of alcohol vendors rotting away, fiddlers, for some reason, sawing off their arms. And these were all the sins of white men and women. And through the Gaiweo, this message, Hanson Lake's followers learned how to avoid them, or at least how to live with them. And it should not be viewed, and I think you can see this, as an anti-colonial, strictly anti-white religious message. Hanson Lake borrowed a lot of concepts. Like all these native prophetic figures, he borrowed a lot of concepts. And one of the classic examples is on his vision. Outside of the heaven, who do they meet? You know the story? Who's standing out there? George Washington. He's not quite in Seneca's heaven, but he's outside. He's like he was, this is according to Jimmy Johnson, a story that related this to Lewis Henry Morgan later on. George Washington was there, quote, dressed in his uniform, and in a state of, obviously this is Morgan's language, taking what he's hearing. Because Seneca's didn't speak like this, but Washington was there, dressed in his uniform, in a state of perfect felicity. He is destined to remain through eternity in the solitary enjoyment of the celestial residence prepared for him by the Great Spirit. And why would Washington, town destroyer, have this reverenced position in a Seneca heaven? The explanation was that it was Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, that put through Congress the Trade and Intercourse Act. And again, the Trade and Intercourse Act is the bedrock of everything. The Senecas knew the law, they understood the law, they complained when the law was broken, they appealed to the law, they saw that law as a guarantee of their lands. They also complained about the Treaty of Canandaigua. And what we have here, I would argue, is a principle that Haudenosaunee people today call Guswenta, G-U-S-W-E-N-T-A. Some of you follow these things. There's a big thing going on in New York State now. It's got a website, Honor the Two-Row Wampum Bell. And the Two-Row Treaty took place in 1613, or may have taken place in 1613. There's some dispute over whether there was an actual treaty. That treaty may or may not have been represented by a wampum belt known as the Two-Row Wampum Belt, which you see all over the place. It's two purple parallel stripes on a field of white. And whether or not the treaty occurred, and whether or not the belt represents a treaty, the principle is there. And the principle is unmistakable in Iroquois, in the documentary record over an extended period of time. And that is that Iroquois argued that they and their non-Indian neighbors should operate like two boats in the same stream, following parallel courses. In other words, we share this continent, we occupy the continent together, we occupy New York State together, but you got your things, we got ours. And that's how they understood precisely the Treaty of Canandaigua, which said, look, we have free use and enjoyment of our lands. And that is incidentally the source of a lot of Iroquois arguments today about sovereignty and autonomy. Okay, so that's the Hanson Lake message. While Hanson Lake was developing this religious message, his half-brother, Corn Planter, was also considering the best way for the Senecas to live in the midst of growing numbers of white people. And here's what Corn Planter said. This is a letter. He spoke in Seneca, and of course the Quakers translated in English and delivered it. He wrote that the Great Spirit intended that the Senecas should not continue to live by hunting, but should till the ground with the plow as the white people do. In other words, he was willing to make certain accommodations to the new reality towards the end of hanging on to their land. It was Cornplanter who in 1798 invited the Quakers to come to Seneca country and establish missions. He asked them to come to teach the Senecas so that, quote, we should cease pursuing after the wild beasts of the forest and turn from the ways of our forefathers to be tillers of the ground and keepers of flocks and herds. And what it argued is that Cornplanter was very, very good, extremely talented at telling white people what they wanted to hear for his own purposes. In fact, in their exchanges with Quakers and in their exchanges with state and federal officials, their encounters with all sorts of people, the Seneca speakers often emphasized the extent to which they were suffering from the effects of white civilization. And these laments that were struggling and were suffering, that were poor, and that were not getting by, these have led the Quakers and people who believed that Indians needed to be removed for their own good, and I would argue even the very famous anthropologist Anthony F.C. Wallace, to conclude that the Senecas truly were suffering. Anthony F.C. Wallace, a very famous book called Death and Rebirth of the Senecas, published back in 1970, argued that the Senecas were in fact, after the Big Tree Treaty, living in slums in the wilderness. That they were that degraded and that poor. Wallace depicted a deeply dysfunctional society suffering from all kinds of pathologies that come with poverty, wife beating, alcoholism, all these kinds of problems. And what it seems to be, if you actually look at the records of what's going on in these communities, that many of these white visitors to Seneca country were too quick to take at face value Seneca depictions of their own wretchedness in their addresses and correspondence. This may have been a rhetorical style that they used. Even the Quakers' own records, and again, they're abundant, they're just incredible documents. These Quaker records hint at how the Senecas are striving for prosperity and trying to keep their economic independence. And the Senecas welcomed the Quakers. They didn't want other groups, but they wanted the Quakers. They told the Quakers that you're welcome here because you will make us more happy, and you will teach us, listen to this, teach us useful trades, such as blacksmiths, millwrights, wheelwrights, and carpenters, that we may build houses, mills, and do other necessary things to make our lives more comfortable. They're planning on staying, right? And the Quakers understood this. The Quakers understood perfectly well that the Senecas had not the slightest bit of interest in the Quakers' religious mission. Timothy Pickering, he explained to a federal agent, like, why aren't you Quakers turning the Indians into little Quakers? Timothy Pickering said, Jasper Parish, the great object is not to teach, for the Quakers, is not to teach peculiar doctrines, but useful practices, to instruct the Indians in husbandry and the plain mechanical arts and manufactures directly connected with it. Right? Perhaps other changes would come once the Senecas learned to live on their lands. And what the Quakers wanted to do, they had a strategy. The Quakers believed that the way to achieve the kind of instruction they did would be to isolate the Senecas from surrounding people. So we'll teach the men to farm, we'll teach them to cut timber, and we will isolate them from the market economy. We'll keep the bad people out, and they'll have their own little communities. Women, right? These Quakers obsessed over women. We will get the women out of the fields and into the household. Spinning wheels, right? We'll teach them to spin. We'll teach them to make cloth. We will isolate them from all the unsavory influences out there. The Senecas wanted to learn all this stuff, but they had no interest in isolation. Right? If the Senecas had their way, there would be no more Senecas. If the Quakers had their way, there would be no more Senecas wandering through the woods, hunting and trapping and trading. They would all just stay on their farms, self-sufficient American yeoman farmers. It's an elusive myth. They'd own their land as individuals, another elusive issue with the Senecas, and communal land ownership would go away. Well, it's fascinating. The Senecas wanted to learn to read and speak and write in English. As one historian pointed out, the Senecas transformed themselves, from a very good book by a guy named Matthew Dennis. The Senecas transformed themselves with the guidance of Quakers, finding new ways to feed themselves, organize social life, act effectively in a larger, more complicated white world, and address the wishes of the Great Spirits. But they didn't want to become red Quakers. They didn't want to become assimilated Indians, but rather they wanted to become kind of new model Senecas, mixing metaphors from a couple of centuries here. But the Friends' non-coercive approach helped them do that. They could take what they wanted. So the Senecas made very significant change with the help of the Society of Friends. And the Friends, year after year, talked about how great the Senecas are doing. They reported, for example, one year, that we are pleased to find that some of the Indian men are beginning to help their women to work and raise corn, to make fence. In 1801, Quakers told Corn Planter, the Senecas you'll see that your ground is good, that you may raise a great deal of wheat, rye, corn, potatoes, and other good things like the white people. And then 3 years later, another Quaker passing through, this 1804, indicated the Senecas were, quote, making considerable progress in agriculture, live in tolerable log houses, and have a number of cattle, horses, and hogs. Hopkins was stunned to see the Senecas clearing fields and working plows. And every year, every letter, just piling up year by year, evidence that the Senecas have, quote, much declined the use of strong drink. We see an encouraging improvement in agriculture and some of the mechanic arts, as also in the regularity of their lives and manners. Evidence that they built 100 houses, most of them well put up, of hewn logs made of, many of them 2 stories high and covered with shingles. In 1810, just rattling these off, right? Friends reported that the condition of this people is already, in various respects, considerably ameliorated, and as a liberal and steady perseverance is maintained on our part, a hope is cherished they will be enabled to overcome the difficulties attendant on the former mode of life and to acquire a comfortable living by their own labor. And even James Monroe wrote to them. He got these reports from the Quakers, and he was very proud of them. He said, I'm glad, quote, that you no longer live in that miserable and destitute state that you once did. He didn't mean New York. He meant state. He said, most of you have become sober and industrious, that you've got good houses to live in, and that by cultivating ground and raising cattle, you now have plenty to eat. Well, there were obstacles. There were significant problems. Alcohol could still disrupt communities. There's no way to sugarcoat that. Trespasses on Seneca land continued. Livestock was stolen. It was rustled. Jasper Parrish, the commissioner, the federal agent, when stationed in Canandaigua, he ran some thieves down who stole some Seneca horses out on the Allegheny Reservation. He ran them down. I don't know how he did this without permission, but he ran them down in Ontario. Dragged them back for trial, and of course they were acquitted by the jury of their peers. And as Parrish, it's people like Parrish that, from experiences like this, said this is why we need to remove them. They will never have protection of person or property when they live in the midst of white people, because white people will not pay attention to the law. They don't care about the laws. No jury will convict a New Yorker for stealing livestock or beating up an Indian. It just won't happen. So let's move them to protect them. It's a tough problem. And then you have groups like the Ogden Land Company, right, who claimed, the Ogden Land Company was a company that owned nothing, right? It owned the right of preemption, right? And the right of preemption is nothing more than the right to buy the land from the Indians, the exclusive right to buy the land from the Indians. They had the title. The Indians had a right of occupancy, which was something less. The Ogden Company came in and started surveying the land while the Senecas still had it. There were significant threats. The Senecas expected the Treaty of Canandaigua would guarantee them free use and enjoyment of their lands, while some of the wealthiest men in Western New York didn't find it that way and were already dividing it up, looking forward to the Senecas' demise. The Quakers were instrumental in countering the efforts of the Ogden Land Company. their literacy, their understanding of the American political system, educating the Senecas on how to do that. So, we've got the Handsome Lake religion, we've got the assistance provided by the Quakers, and then the efforts of the Senecas themselves, the selective changes the Senecas made. And the Senecas made these changes to how they lived for reasons that often eluded the Quakers. I mean, they were making changes because it benefited them, not because it benefited the Quakers. If the Quakers wanted, for example, to preserve the Senecas by isolating them from all the bad people out there, protecting them, the Senecas made all kinds of choices to try to preserve their independence, their ability to move. And that's an old canoe, but the ability to move through space is one of the constants of Iroquois culture throughout the region. And again, the Senecas debated very much the extent to which they would engage themselves with the market economy. And if you know anything about sort of the early republic, the antebellum period in American history, these kind of debates brought divisions to all kinds of rural communities, right? The Great Transformation is what historians of rural capitalism call it, the extent to which you switched from a subsistence economy to a cash and capital-based economy. Senecas had the same debates as did other rural Americans about the extent and the risks and the rewards that came with engaging with the market. But the Senecas did it from a different point, right? The Senecas tried to transform woodlands into farmlands. They enclosed fields, they built roads. But while their white neighbors are trying to acquire land to do this, the Senecas are trying to hang on to what they got against, again, a company that feels they have the right to do this. And the Senecas are, the fascinating thing about these Quaker documents is you see Senecas everywhere doing all kinds of things that would have made the Quakers, or must have made the Quakers, just go nuts. I mean, but they knew what was going on. They wrote about it. For example, Seneca sold alcohol in western New York. I mean, this is the drug trade of the time. It's prohibited under federal law to sell alcohol without a license. Senecas were selling alcohol not just to Indians, but to people in Buffalo and in Black Rock and areas like that. Others continued to hunt. This frustrated the Quakers too, right? The Quakers are talking about how, oh, soon all the animals are going to be gone. There's going to be no more wild game left to hunt. No one told the Senecas, and apparently no one told the deer. These little, and raccoon, mink, muskrats, all of which seemed to thrive as the white population in New York increased. There was no shortage of game. Senecas go out all over the place and hunt. According to John Norton, who was a Mohawk, a very interesting Mohawk who visited, he lived in Grand River in Ontario. He visited the Seneca in 1809. He said the Senecas, quote, could conveniently take skins, meat, and timber to Pittsburgh, where they generally get a good price for these articles. And the trip downriver from Allegheny just took 2 or 3 days. Senecas would paddle downriver, trade their furs, trade the venison, all kinds of things, and make cash. Markets for their crops, agricultural produce. Seneca farmers produced flax. They were supposed to produce this flax, make it into cloth, and make their own clothing to become self-sufficient. They didn't do that. They made this into cloth and sold it to white people who needed linen. They found food crops, or outlets for their food crops and for their livestock as well. Non-Indian observers writing during the War of 1812, which was a pretty tense period of time in Western New York, were buying corn from Indian women. There were genuine scarcities. As one Quaker observed, the Senecas not only use their land not only for their own subsistence, but sell considerable to white people. And these are these figures. At Allegheny, the Allegheny Reservation, far southwestern corner of the state, 439 Senecas owned 479 cattle, 58 horses, 350 hogs, and had 700 acres of improved lands, not counting meadowland that had been cleared for and was used for pasture. Seneca farmers were producing surpluses that they were selling to non-Indian neighbors for cash and goods. Some of the account books, the Quakers, you can tell the Quakers had seen account books And they describe it as kind of a double entry debit credit account book, but I haven't actually seen any of these books myself, but they're out there. And the Senecas encouraged Quakers, or the Quakers, I'm sorry, the Quakers encouraged Senecas to acquire livestock and to buy these animals. And the hope was that they would use these animals for draft, to pull things, and to eat. They wanted them to get oxen and things like that. The Senecas really just wanted horses more than anything else. Another thing that frustrated the Quakers. And why did they want horses? The Senecas watched their white neighbors using horses for labor and for transport in lumbering activities. And so the Quakers didn't want the Senecas to get involved in the timber economy. In fact, the Quakers built the first Senecas their first sawmill and realized that maybe this was not the thing to do. And then when after that broke down, they started using a Quaker sawmill, and they would complain when the Quakers charged them too much of a milling fee, too much cash. Well, here's what they said. The Quakers in 1818, they complained that, they said, well, the Senecas are making great progress in agriculture. They're doing wonderful. They're doing more than we ever thought. We could be doing more if so many Senecas, quote, were not much drawn to the cutting and rafting of pine timber. And timber became a fundamental part of the Seneca economy. Really throughout the 19th century, Senecas would sell stands of trees for harvesting and cutting by white lumbermen. And this allowed elderly and infirm and perhaps widowed Senecas to derive a livelihood from lands that they didn't have the physical capacity to work themselves. The Ogden Company constantly complained about this, right? Because the Ogden Company had title to the land. And what are the Senecas doing? They're selling the assets off the land to make money. It drove the Senecas nuts, but they couldn't stop this happening. And Senecas frequently complained when people illegally came onto their land to cut timber. They knew they had a valuable resource here. They wanted to monopolize that resource. Millions of board feet of timber was cut from Seneca land. And again, the first sawmill opened in Cattaraugus County in 1795, operated by Corn Planter. The Senecas would operate their mills, they'd cut their timber, they'd form this timber into rafts, and they would float it down to Pittsburgh during periods of high water. And they'd carry with them on these raft peltries, this is what the Quakers, right, they'd carry with them their peltry, furs, and wood canoes to push up their return cargoes. So they'd take the canoes down on these rafts, load up with whatever they got, and paddle back up the river. It's a fantastic story. And all the Quakers could do was ask them, maybe you should do something else. It asked them to consider, in a letter to the Senecas, whether you would not have been in a better situation generally if you had employed the same time which you had spent in cutting and rafting timber in cultivating your good lands. Well, they didn't want to do that. They cut the timber, they got to move, men got to travel, moved down the Allegheny, they moved downstream, they hit Warren, they hit Franklin, they hit Pittsburgh. Some Senecas earned reputations as skilled river pilots, a talent for which they could be paid quite well. It's just a very complex regional economy in which the Senecas involve themselves. And again, they're doing everything. They're carrying furs. This is into the 1830s. They're carrying furs. They're carrying salted pork that they preserve themselves. They're carrying finished goods like shingles and barrel staves and finished lumber. They're carrying moccasins to sell. I'm not sure what, it'd be interesting to do a paper on what the market was for some of this stuff in Pittsburgh to see how it was advertised and how it was carried. And they're selling this for cash and for goods they couldn't acquire in Western New York. And just paddling back up the river. And so I think there's some important lessons to be drawn from this discussion of the relationship between the Senecas and the Friends. And I don't think you can overestimate the importance of the Quakers. I mean, their contribution to helping the Senecas hang onto their lands was critical. Just one additional example, 1838, the Treaty of Buffalo Creek. It was the Indian removal treaty for the Six Nations. It is, and I've looked at a few of these, it is the most corrupt treaty in the history of the United States, without question. the most corrupt treaty. The negotiations took place at times in a tavern, where intoxicated Indians were led to sign treaties. There were negotiations held where, according to Seneca's, they were held at gunpoint and forced to sign treaties, and there were imposters used to sign their names saying they were other people. We know about these, and thanks now to the miracle of Google Books, all these published Quaker accounts are on Google Books. The Quakers compiled deposition after deposition documenting these abuses. You can't really see it. You see the tree, a big tree over there. And treaties generally had, when they were completed, had 3 pieces to them. And those of you who are in the Iroquois class know this, right? You have the actual agreement, right? And at the bottom, this one just has 2 pieces. It's missing one part. But you have the part that's where the treaty is spelled out and the participants in the council sign the treaty. And then that document will be sent to the Senate for ratification, right? And when it was ratified by the Senate, a piece on the bottom would be physically stitched on to show that. You signify that. And then when it's proclaimed, and you can see it's like the top 1/4 of that paper if you're close enough to see it. And if you walk out, you can see it. You actually physically see the stitches where the president's proclamation, once it's been ratified, is stitched on. And often treaties were relatively neat like this. The Buffalo Creek Treaty, they never show that one. It looks like a phone book. It looks like you would have to hold it together on a clipboard because they're running around saying, you sign it. Then they're running over to BlackRock saying, you sign it, and saying, well, we need your signature, but we can't get you to sign it, so can you just sign his name? And it just stunk. It's because of the Quakers that we know of those misdeeds, and it was that Quaker effort that prevented essentially the ratification of that treaty for 3 years, and while that delay was going on, a compromise was worked out. Devastating for the Senecas nonetheless, but far less devastating than the loss of all their lands in New York State. Quakers helped do that. It would have done that without the Quakers. It's also revealing that the only way to get the Seneca's land was through fraud and violence. Something worth keeping in mind. So the Senecas are important. But I think also that we need to keep in mind that the Senecas always engaged with these missionaries on their own terms. They accepted the advice, they accepted the technology, and ignored the rest, and did with it what they wanted to do. They never altered their religion in response to the Quakers. They absorbed ideas. There's no doubt about that. If we talk about Hanson Lake's religion, certain things crept in, but they didn't change their religion. They engaged selectively with a market economy. They preserved their freedom of movement, even as their land base was dwindling. They preserved a significant degree of their autonomy. They preserved their connections. This is something that is too seldom understood. They preserved their connections to other Iroquois people living across a broader Iroquois. Newspaper accounts from 19th century New York show Senecas moving across the Ridge Road, going west, stopping at Tonawanda, which after 1848 is sort of a separate entity from the Seneca Nation of Indians. Onondagas traveling all over the place, moving across the border into Canada to visit the Iroquois Longhouse at Grand River. Mohawks visiting Grand River, Easy way coming along the lake shore and stopping periodically. So they kept all these things, and I think it's a remarkable achievement. And again, I would point out that if any number of people had had their way, they wouldn't have been here. And not only did they survive that, but they're here. They're operating under a constitution, like I said at the beginning, that is older than that of half the states in the Union and older than many European countries. And they are the largest employer now in Niagara County, admittedly. It's Niagara County, but they are the largest employer in Niagara County. So that's what I had to say. I could keep going, but if you have any questions, I think I can just stop there. Right? I don't know how long I've spoken. If you have any questions.
Questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Getting back to the beginning of the end, the Big Tree Treaty, knowing how the Geneseo kind of meanders around and around and around, was the Big Tree Treaty signed at that location for the reason that they gave up all the land west of the Genesee? That seems to be the spot right there that you're talking about,
Yeah.
west of the Genesee.
The short answer is I don't know. I don't think the Morrises say anything other than they want to meet at Big Tree. So I'm not sure what the thinking was. I mean, in a sense, it's if you're coming from the east, which the Morrises would, you'd want to hit the easternmost, you'd want to meet at the easternmost point. And that, we'd be getting pretty close to that with Big Tree, right?
The River Road
Yeah.
is actually west of the Big Tree location, correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the specifics of the geography.
West River, right, or East River, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
don't know.
the West River Road is west of the river,
Yeah.
but my thought was that the true location of Big Tree was east of that location.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'd never been to the site.
Yeah,
I was led to believe that was west of the river.
It's a good question, and I don't remember Morris saying anything about why that location and not another. It's a good question. Yeah.
What were the circumstances that compelled Mary Jennison to sell back the Garter Flats?
Well, that's a matter of some debate. It seems that she was, if you read sort of the old Doty accounts and things like that, we don't have her words here, but it sounds like she wasn't entirely clear on the terms of the agreement. You can debate that though. I mean, because she did hang on to a parcel of her own land. She's a very ambiguous figure and an ambivalent figure in Iroquois history during this period, because it's hard to say, she's a white woman in Geneseo, how Seneca is she? How consistent is she with Seneca values on holding on to land? And I'm just not sure I have decided where I stand on that yet. Yeah.
Was the Sullivan-Clinton expedition the high water mark for the Seneca Nation in West Virginia?
No. No.
They prevailed beyond that?
Well, they didn't prevail. I mean, militarily they were beaten badly in Sullivan. Well, the men weren't defeated, but the towns were destroyed. But those areas were reoccupied pretty quickly, and Iroquois warriors were not knocked out of the war. They did a number at Cherry Valley, far to the east of here, the next year, and that is why Iroquois leaders, people like Joseph Brant, who were operating out of Fort Niagara in this area, which was sort of the refugee haven after the war. They were, as Kent said, thunderstruck at 1783 treaty. They were ready to keep fighting. And that there was a period of years under the Confederation where, and you can see this in the proceedings of the New York Indian Commissioners during the Confederation era, where people like James Wayne would argue that in our diplomacy with the Iroquois we should dispense with all this mumbo-jumbo about covenant chain and clearing a forest. And the United States did that too. The 1784 Fort Stanwix Treaty, which was the peace treaty after the war. Federal commissioners kind of walked in and thumped the Iroquois on the chest and said, this is how it's going to be. You lose. The problem was they hadn't lost. And when Washington came in, and this discussion begins in 1786, 1787 in Congress, is that we simply have a problem here, that we're treating Indians like conquered people who are not conquered people. And when you had the military defeats in 1790 and 1791 in the West, where U.S. armies going out to explain to Indians that the forces of the United States numbered like the trees in the woods and the stars in the sky, get their heads handed back to them, that's when the federal government said we need to make peace with the Seneca Nation in Canandaigua. And the interesting thing about Canandaigua is it took place in November. The council started probably late September, thereabouts. It could be wrong about that. It started in the fall. When that council began, the United States already knew that the Western Confederacy that had defeated U.S. forces had itself been defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. There was no threat anymore of the Senecas joining the Western Confederacy, because that Western Confederacy was done. Nonetheless, the United States felt, the Washington administration felt, that the Senecas were such a threat, should they go over to the other side, given their geographic position, that we need to negotiate with them. And the treaty did a number of things. Canandaigua, one of the things it did is it redrew the western boundary of the Seneca Nation. The Canandaigua, the 1784 treaty said that the western edge of Iroquois, that map doesn't help us here, but the western edge of Iroquois was would be a line drawn 4 miles east of the Niagara River. okay? So that the river was not part of Iroquois anymore. And that infuriated the Iroquois because they wanted that outlet to the west. And in Canandaigua, the boundary was redrawn as being along the river. That gave the Senecas the riverbanks. It gave the Iroquois the right to keep in touch and move freely back and forth between Canada and the United States, a right that was also reaffirmed in the 1795 Jay Treaty, and which would come to haunt the United States to some extent during the War of 1812, when they had to worry once again that these guys could just go over to Ontario, arm up if they get upset, and come back to New York and set New York on fire. It really required some very careful diplomacy. So that by preserving this freedom of movement and through diplomacy, the Senecas kept a lot of freedom of movement. So I think 1779 was a blow, no question about it. It was destructive, but it destroyed physical things and not people, and it didn't destroy claims to the land.
Very good. One more question?
What was the population of the Senecas during the Revolutionary War?
You know, I've just been reading. By far the most numerous. I'm guessing. I don't want to guess.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to guess.
Is there an estimate of how many Senecas are in western New York today?
Yes, there is, and I can't tell you what it is.
Okay.
I don't know how to figure. Yeah, and it depends on what you count. I think, what did the Census Bureau say last night? I
70,000? I don't know.
No, I mean, it might be around that. It's significant. I mean, there's no excuse for not knowing this. So, mea culpa. I was just talking with someone before the talk. There are censuses all over the place counting the number of Senecas. You know, and all the Iroquois. And someone can do some great research with it. It has nothing to do with the U.S. Census Bureau. But up through 1924, we have incredible population figures for all the Iroquois communities in New York State. We have those because the state did censuses. They were often aggregate censuses, just how many people are there, how many acres of bushels of potatoes, how many sheep and goats and things like that. But they also, in the state archives, and when I went through these records, it was clear no one had looked at it in a long, long time. But every year, the state paid an annuity. And state annuities were 1815, the 1815 Grand Island Treaty. Every year, the federal agent did a sort of a census to find out how many Senecas there were, to find out what each share would be. And then when they collected their share, they all signed. So you get 2 documents for every year that tell you not only the numbers, but how many people are, who those people are. And you can follow that year. Basically through 1924, you have these records.
Okay, great, thanks. One more. I'm sorry.
The Seneca were a matrilineal society.
Yeah.
So I guess what I was wondering is what the effect of the men doing all the negotiating, what was the effect on their culture? Where were the women and what were they saying? And what was the aftermath there?
Well, that's a good question. Men were always doing the negotiation. I mean, it's not matriarchal, it's matrilineal, so descent is traced through the women's line. And so it didn't have much effect on politics. Women appointed traditionally the League Sagas, right? These are the traditional leaders of the Iroquois League. There are some historians who argue that the League, as a spiritual, social entity, was supplanted in the late, anywhere between the late 17th and 18th century by the Iroquois Confederacy, which these scholars argue is a different thing. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's a view. In the Confederacy, you have leaders who are chosen not for primarily ceremonial religious reasons, but they're chosen for their capacity to speak English or as military leaders. Women weren't doing diplomacy in any of these instances. There certainly were communications at home. There are documents in the 1790s, for example. There's a document at the Huntington Library in California where I don't know how it got there. That's an interesting question in itself. But Onondaga women complaining about, or an Onondaga leader, male leader, complaining about a land cession and using that the women back home are unhappy about this as a way to get at it. So there's that whole part of it. But what you do see is an even more interesting question is how do women react to these social changes? The way Quakers saw it, women were drudges, right? The squaw drudges. They did the men's work, the way Seneca saw it, because women did agricultural work. Okay? And they wanted, in a sense, to liberate women from the field and let them go into the house. But really what that meant, what they're offering women, is to replace the solitary, replace the communal drudgery of agricultural work with the solitary drudgery of working in a house, spinning cloth, churning butter, feeding chickens, and caring for children. And it seems that women were fairly selective in these adaptions as well. There were women on these boats going down the Allegheny as well. So women still had much more freedom of movement and freedom of choice in Seneca society than white women had in Anglo-American society. But in terms of politics, it's hard to say what they're doing. And often in scholarship, their political importance is overstated. I mean, because frankly, you got to keep in mind that English people and French people didn't generally view women as proper parties with whom to negotiate either. All right.
We do have some refreshments here in the main room if you want to hang around a little bit longer.